Welcome to the Xeno Podcast, where we talk about how we shape stories and how they shape us. Today is a very special day because it is, Jackson's birthday.
Oh, yeah.
So,
we're doing that.
Happy birthday
Thanks.
to him. It's his birthday podcast.
Wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
And also, we have a very special guest, Dr. Phillip H. McArthur, who is the Dean of College of Arts and Humanities and a professor in cultural anthropology and integrated humanities. He's a published author of many works relating to folklore, cultural identity, and the Marshall Islands. So that's our guest today.
All right.
Thank you.
Before we get started, rumor on the street around BYU is that you're a book sniffer? What does that mean?
Well, I've lost my gift, my acuity for book sniffing as I used to have, but that is true.
Wow.
I used to, I have so many books that I'd read that I could smell the book and I could identify which press it came from, whether it was Duke or Oxford or Harvard or University of California, just by sniffing it.
Wow.
Is it the kind of paper?
It's because every press has different paper, different ink, and different glue. And they're very distinct. And, when you read, part of it's an olfactory experience, right? It's not just purely the words there and holding it, but you have olfaction going on here, too. And so some of the real great books smell good.
Yeah, they do smell good. Like the old book smell is just like so good. So.
Now, if you're comfortable, we both picked our favorite smelling books, and we want you to say which one is better.
Okay, it's the press that I know.
Yeah.
It wasn't just any. Yeah.
Okay, we'll just see. This is just an old book.
Which book smells better?
Yeah, which smells better.
Yeah.
So we've got a developmental book.
That's just a musty old book. Hey, this is a good critical. I have this book. Well, this one's not that pleasant either. It's really perfumey.
That's what I thought. I didn't like that one as much.
It's one of those that after about 45 minutes of trying to get through Nietzsche, you would go, I don't know if I like Nietzsche anymore. But neither one of those is very pleasant.
Interesting.
Try
Old
something.
and too gross.
Our smell acumen is it's just
so
not.
low.
But you think about it. Think about your memories.
Mm-hmm.
Just a whiff of some smell, your memory will go back to that place and the time and your thoughts and your feelings in that place. It will trigger memory as much as any sound and even the visual things we do.
Yeah.
I should have brought Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah, those are good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I wonder how much book smells have shaped people's lives. Just it's the quiet.
Well,
Absolutely.
The interesting thing to me would be is, does the smell affect your response to the argument being made?
Right.
If it's a pleasant smell and you're enjoying it, are you inclined to be more open to the argument and what is being presented, or are you recoiling, pulling back? Or does it lead to different kinds of memory, improvement of memory? I don't know. This is all purely speculative. But think about if you haven't traveled much, especially when you travel internationally.
Mm-hmm.
Every country, and certainly cities and regions of countries, have a distinct smell as soon as you get off that plane, right?
Yeah.
You get out there, and the different kinds of flora and of the region, the soils, but also people and the things they eat, and they have distinct smells.
Mm-hmm.
And we never capture that. That's part of the life experience and the bodily experience we have in cross-cultural engagements, but we never talk about smell. We talk about meaning and words and languages and what we see in the buildings and the architecture and the clothing and the behaviors, the traditions and things. But we don't talk about smell as tradition and smell as part of the experience. I've always wanted to create a little scratch and sniff ethnography where you can smell the culture you're going to, But it's a real significant part of our daily lives, but we don't know how to really talk about it and address it. It's just kind of backgrounded.
Yeah, and that's kind of anthropology, right? That's where your interest in anthropology kind of ties into that.
Yeah, and you think about what people respond to when they go cross-culturally, that they recoil at more than the differences of language and everyday overt behavior is smells and food. Mm-hmm. Culture shock is first registered in the food. I don't like what they're,
Yeah.
And smell and, taste and olfaction are closely linked together. But we never really have a way of addressing those kinds of things. Some cultures actually try to capitalize on smell.
Mm-hmm.
So take, for example, even here in the Pacific Islanders have made an art out of creating smells through flowers, right?
Yeah.
And then the different kinds of leis. And they're intended that way, and they register different kinds of things for different kinds of events. And there's other cultures who make meaning out of smell. Mm-hmm. And certainly the industry of food has, even in the Western world. They even try to make, as soon as you walk through that restaurant's door, that you get a whiff of certain things. Yeah. That gets you to order and buy. And the smells seem to operate at such an unconscious level that, all the work on pheromones and male-female interest and desire and attraction, there's been a lot of look at that as well, and you're not aware of it. It's completely out of your common awareness. But you may or may not be attracted to a person depending on how they smell. Mm-hmm. And then there's a whole industry of perfumes, right, that try to capitalize on that in colognes, that principle, to draw a companion, a mate.
Yeah. You smell bad, it's just not happening.
Yeah, right.
Probably top deal breakers for people is somebody who smells bad. I'm sure.
Oh, sure. Yeah. But it's been interesting that you'd think that certain smells, like a sweaty male, after doing exercise or athletic event, we may not be that attractive. But certain kinds of sweating bodies become very enticing, and they may not recognize it, but there's just like they like being around it, and they're attracted to that musk-like male thing, or this, and then those smells become gendered, right?
Yeah.
Certain smells are associated with femininity, certain ones with masculinity, and some of those are culturally conventions. They may or may not be anything in nature, but we learn that those smells are feminine. Those smells or something.
Like flowers or musky. Like I'm just thinking of like male deodorants versus female, like how they brand them. One is like very floral. One's like musk, bear, ox.
Oh, and then they give them these names. And be like,
Wolf Ridge.
You will be this lightning fast macho tiger for wearing this, kind of thing. Yeah. So clearly the advertising industry and smell industry knows that how this is working.
Yeah. That's
and plays upon it. Yeah.
So you did work in the Marshall Islands, or you've studied the Marshall Islands a lot, and
I have.
I mean, you live in the United States. So, I mean, have you noticed anything specific in the differences between how the societies address smell?
Well, on the surface of it, there's a lot of variables going on, but on the surface of it, in terms of what is appropriate proxemics or body distance for engaging in a conversation, or intimacy to familiarity to closeness in relationships of family, to just a general associate familiarity to formality. And each cultures have different expectations in how far you are from each other in those different kinds of relationships. And some of that has to do with smell, not all of it. There's all kinds of other variables going on. But to be close up and not to be close is very distinct from Marshall Islands in America, how you are to engage that, especially intragender relationships that would be forbidden in the West, and they would suggest it means something else. But those intra-male, female contact is understood to be something else than in the United States, certainly.
Are we at a good distance?
No, you're too far away.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be very much closer.
Right.
Even as a professional,
Yeah. But it's not as pronounced to take, for example, certain Arab nations, Arab cultures, right? Mm-hmm. They're very close together. They've become masters of reading each other's pupils to see what your disposition is. And that's one reason why they wear sunglasses even in buildings. Not because they're trying to, the brightness of the sun or be cool, but because they get right up at each other and they look at each other and they see where you're at by your eyes. But they'll be taking a deep smell, to see where you're at and start to detect things. But look here in the Pacific, right? We kiss each other on the cheek all the time, right? Or take the Maori who come up and nose to nose and breathe each other's breathe it in.
Yeah.
And Americans are not going to greet each other with a deep breath, but we're smelling each other.
Yeah, we are.
Just more subtle.
Yeah. So
cool.
So from the Pacific, or then you take certain cultures like the Germans, who are some of the furthest apart, who keep each other. There's greater distances. The Arabs are some of those the most close together. Latin nations are fairly close. European, especially Northern European, you start getting further apart. Asian, they're very comfortable. Certain ones, for example, in China, they're very comfortable being squeezed and pressed together on a train, where we're just feeling recoiled. Right.
Yeah, very.
And that train ride smells.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying them pejoratively, but there are a lot of smells when you're right up there with 40 other people boxed in. Marshall Islands, they'll make comments. Because they experienced Americans through the World War, too. And most of those soldiers who are there fighting aren't smelling very good.
Yeah.
Okay, they've been in battle for days on sweating, right?
Yeah.
Like these Americans.
It smells so terrible.
They're liberators and they're big and tall, but man, maybe they need to go bathe in the lagoon and then we'll have a conversation.
Yeah. So we actually read an article by you. I have it here. So the ambivalent fantasies, local prehistories, and global dramas in the Marshall Islands.
Yeah.
So kind of your observations on the relationship between the U.S. and the Marshall Islands.
Yeah.
And the bombing that went on in the atoll. Could you explain for people who maybe don't know the history between those?
Yeah, to get the American piece of this, we got to go back just a little bit, because prior to American occupation, the Japanese had occupied. It was part of their imperial outreach.
Yeah.
And they had taken control of the Marshall Islands by 1914, and the League of Nations by 1920 had granted it to Japan. League of Nations was the precursor to the United Nations. Okay.
Right.
And prior to the Japanese were the German colonialists who came out to exploit the copra possibilities, coconut. And before that, you have some contacts with Spanish and British. The Marshall Islands are named after the British Captain Marshall. Okay. So you've got a series of colonial incursions upon the Marshall Islands for more than a century. Really, if we go back to Spaniards, it's 2.5. Okay.
Yeah.
And so by the time the United States arrives with the war in the early 1940s, they have been occupied for quite some time, okay, by a variety of sequence of different groups. So the United States starts to invade into the Marshall Islands in 1942 and in 1943. And it's part of the United States strategy is to get from Hawaii and keep pushing the Japanese back across Micronesia all the way back, and then arrive finally at the Philippines in their great push back to arrive. McArthur says, shall return. I will come back. Japanese are unable to occupy Hawaii. It just tacks on Pearl Harbor. Okay?
Yeah.
And so the strategy is for the Americans are seeing this strictly as a launching pad, the first initial steps to be pushing the Japanese back. So they invade the Marshall Islands. Okay, and most of their invasions are air attacks. They're not really landing. They only land at Eniwetok and Kwajalein. Kwajalein, you may have heard of, is where the missile tracking range is today for the United States. Continues to occupy it. The rest of them, they're just doing bombing runs to just isolate and frustrate the Japanese. And then they take the islands, and then they just keep moving. But they leave a certain number of resources or military personnel to continue to occupy the islands, so that by the end of the war, the Marshall Islands are occupied by the Navy Department, and they're administrating and running the islands. Okay. And then by 1946, the United States determines that these isolated atolls in the middle of the Pacific would be the primary location for their nuclear testing initiatives. Right. And so they relocate the Marshallese first. Most Americans here think of it as Bikini. Marshallese pronounce it Bikini.
Bikini.
They relocate the Bikini Islanders and then start doing the first atomic bomb hydrogen tests there. And then they relocate the people of Eniwetok by 48 and do a test there. So they do 23 tests in Bikini and 43 in Eniwetok. Okay. So that's where this notorious relationship begins. And these bombs, these hydrogen tests, by the way, Bikini, it's just kind of a fun aside.
Yeah.
The word in English, bikini, comes from that.
Really? How did that work out?
And the French designer of the new swimwear, the two-piece swimwear, is designing this and creating this at the time that these nuclear tests are going on in the 1950s. And he gives it to this blast. Okay, here's a sentence, it's a blast.
Wow.
And it strips bare. Okay. So it's the one Marshallese word that's in the English language.
Bikini, but not pronounced correctly.
It's not pronounced correctly, exactly. And then they remove the islanders directly from those islands so that they can do the atomic bomb tests. Yeah. And they persuade the islanders. It's a forced migration. It's not something they really want to do, but they persuade them to do it. The military general says, you move for us. We're developing technologies to end all wars.
Of course.
You're doing this on the behalf of all mankind, humankind. And they're giving up their homes.
Yeah.
Where their history and their mythology and their lives have been inscribed upon these landscapes for centuries and centuries. And they're giving it up, and then the United States blows them up.
Right.
And so some of the islets are completely incinerated, destroyed. Right. But then the U.S. military doesn't know either, but the nuclear fallout then contaminates these atolls. Still does.
Yeah.
Okay, for generations to come. But even more incredulous, it's problematic, is that winds blow.
Right.
And so the nuclear fallout, the nuclear waste is blowing downwind. And then there's these islanders downwind who never were relocated and moved. And it drops on them.
Oh, wow.
Okay, and we have some pretty good evidence that they intended to see what would happen to the human body. It was human experiments to see what would happen with this fallout. Marshallese will tell me stories that they were little children. They looked out the sky, and they heard from the Americans what snow was, because it looked like this white stuff coming down on their island, and they all ran out and grabbed it. Okay, and now most of those people, not all of them, but a lot of them have experienced stillbirths, deformations of a birth, cancers, thyroid cancers, uterine cancers. It's been really more devastating to the people downwind than the ones who were relocated.
Yeah.
The ones relocated want to go home, but they can't go home, and then they have gone home because they said, oh, it's okay, it's not, the contamination isn't as bad now, you can go home, but then the fallout, the radiation counts are high. It's a very controversial thing.
Yeah.
So we have, in the context of this historical event, an exploitation and an abuse of a group of people. And then the United States occupied Kwajalein Atoll as a missile tracking range that they still do today. And so they fire off from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California inactive warheads to use the lagoon in the Marshall Islands as target practice.
Wow.
But here's one of these complexities. They make rent payment to occupy it. They've relocated the Marshallese off of the main island, because main island is as cush and as nice as anything you'll see in Waikiki, the way the U.S. military lives and personnel. But the Marshallese are moved on to a little islet called Ebi. And there's 30,000 people there on something that's only about 200 meters wide and 2 miles long.
Wow.
And it's considered the slum of the Pacific. There is not a tree on the thing. It's just a slum. And they catch a ferry to go work the base.
Wow.
But the rent payments are huge. But here's the catch. So the government, 50% of their GNP is coming off these rent payments. They don't want the Americans there anymore. But if the Americans leave, they go bankrupt. So they're caught in this this bind here. And then we've got a traditional social structure of chiefs and high chiefs and lesser chiefs and a variety of matrilineals. These are matrilineal people. All rights, inheritance, titles, and ranks pass through women, not through the men. But a man gets authority through his mother. It's a very structured, genealogical, ascribed way of getting authority. They have it. But then there's the controversy of how much those chiefs get, and then the common people don't get anything from those rent payments.
Right.
And it's created a greater stratification and hierarchy and abuses than we've ever seen before. So it's a very precarious relationship the Marshallese have with the United States.
Right.
It's strained. It's fraught with controversy. However, as abusive as the Americans have been to these islands, there's still a relatively positive way. They like Americans. They see them as a powerful gracious world chief who's a great warrior but also kind,
Yes.
because they give us things. So that's why I say ambivalence.
Yeah.
They're both. They see them as both a violent warrior and abusive, but they also see them as the great chief who takes care of his people.
Right.
So yeah.
And that's kind of the Latau, right?
And then that's how Latau the trickster
Yeah.
comes in.
Yeah. Do you want to explain more about that? Just so
Okay,
people
well,
know?
Latau is one amongst the demigods of the Marshall Islands. He's probably the most popular of all of them. People tell stories about Latau all the time. He's not the most important, but he's taken on. He's able to address their modern lives better than just any other god.
Okay.
And so they look to Latau because he's fun, he's playful, he's subversive, but he's the descendant of these really powerful. He's a descendant of these powerful matriarchs. He's connected to these female deities who were so critical to the whole unfolding of the cosmos and the islands. I don't have time to go into all that.
Maybe the next podcast.
But Latau's great because he shows up at all these historical junctures and upends power and authority. That's what he probably does. He's brilliant, he's intelligent, but his intelligence allows him to be the best trickster, devious, subversive, and he undermines authority and power everywhere he goes, and he makes people look like buffoons and idiots. And one of the great stories of him is after he tricks his brother, who's a high chief, he creates a sailing canoe that is beautiful and shiny and looks like the best ever made, but it's made out of ironwood that doesn't float. And his brother makes one out of the breadfruit tree that really does, and he tricks him into trading it, and then he sails off in the really good canoe, and his brother tries to sail off and it sinks, and a great chase ensues. But he does that all over the place. But his great trick was when he gets to Kiribati, the island south of the Marshall Islands. They're having a famine, and the chief Latau asks the chief what's going on, and the chief says, well, we just can't eat. And he goes, well, I can fix that. Create an earth oven. And he creates this earth oven, so you're digging into the earth, and they prepare the stones and the coals. And then he says, and then Latau jumps in. Now Latau he's a shapeshifter, like tricksters all over the world, like Coyote amongst the Native Americans, and Anansi the spider in West Africa. They're all over the place. They shapeshift. They can become different things. And so he jumps into this thing, and he says, cover it, bury me. And they're just amazed by it. And then as they're walking away from the earth oven, he comes walking up, kind of like brushing his hands. He's already escaped from the earth oven. He says, open it. And they open it, and there's this abundance of food, of all kinds of food, and he relieves the famine. And he does this multiple times. But then he tells the chief, I'm leaving. And the chief says, well, you can't leave without teaching me how to do this. I still want to feed my people. And he goes, okay, that works. That's good. Prepare the earth on the fire. Now jump in. And the chief goes, it's hot. And he goes, no, it's all going to be okay. Let's go bury him, cover him, and they cover him in the leaves and the dirt.
Yeesh.
And the wives of the chief of Kiribati are saying, why isn't he coming out? He didn't come out as fast as he used to come out. And he goes, oh, he's just making a lot of good food for everybody. And then eventually he says, okay, uncover it. And they uncover it. And there's a cooked chief. Well done. And then, of course, what does he also want? Latau has enormous libido as well. And so he gets the wives, but then they go after him because he's killed the chief, and he escapes. He escapes, and he ends up, some say, going to Fiji. But at some point, he encounters an American ship. And he can tell the Americans are a little more clever than the others, but they're wealthy. And so he goes with them to America, and he teaches them everything he knows. Then many generations later, out on the horizon, show up these huge ships with these aircraft carriers, with these planes that come in and just completely destroy the Japanese and their authority and their power that is there. And then a few years after that, they build a bomb so powerful that it can destroy the whole earth.
Yeah.
Where did they get all that knowledge and power? The trickster.
Yeah.
And the metaphor of him cooking the chief is perfect, right? Because he has now, the bomb has cooked the Marshallese. Right?
But
at the same time, he brought food to them, because then they always celebrate the Americans came and just gave us all kinds of food and clothing. And it's like, he's dangerous and he's kind. How do you deal with that kind of extreme and contradiction? The trickster resolves the contradiction, because that is what he plays upon, is extremes.
Mm-hmm.
Americans are extreme, Latal's extreme. So that's the basic story of the trickster. So the story doesn't stop. This is the beauty of these kinds of cosmological stories. They keep adapting as life changes. And he keeps showing up. And the other gods seem to fade away, but Latal can keep showing up at other historical junctures and other places. Yeah.
How does Latal affect the Marshallese concept of authority?
Well, that's great. That's a great question, because two things are going on here. One is he subverts authority, okay, but by subverting authority, interestingly enough, you reveal it. You reveal what the authority structure is by challenging it. You just kind of live authority and just assume that's the structure and the hierarchy and the stratification. He comes along and messes it up, and everybody brings it to everybody's attention, so they see it. But also, he's valued too, because authority comes in different ways from the Marshallese. It comes through the lineage, through your mother, the maternal lines, okay, through these chiefly lines. It passes, and one of his aunties, one of the female goddesses, is the one who gave the first title of the high chief, and she gives the canoe and these things that are so important for inter-island intercourse and travel and resources and things. Then another of the great goddesses gives divination. You get power by knowing and understanding what is to come, what is the truth through divination. And then the trickster is the youngest. He shows up, and his power is through clever manipulation and deception. And so to have power and authority is to know how to play a certain kind of indirection, like Latal does. Mm-hmm. You never just, like an American, put out all your cards on the table and say, this is what even in the government, this is what this is what I think, and here's my argument, and it's rational and makes sense. It's much more subtle wordplay in games, almost, and they even say he's being so Latal. Even politicians.
Really? When
they're being so sly and clever like that. Mm-hmm. So it plays out in everyday life too. But tricksters all over the world have a role of subverting authority, but in a way they renew society and culture. They give it new life through their subversive acts.
Yeah, like you cook the chief, but you still bring food.
Yeah, you still bring food. And most tricksters around, they'll seem like that they're causing mischief and trouble, but in their process of causing mischief and trouble, they also give something, a bounty, something life. Like most tricksters give sexuality. Mm-hmm. That's life. That brings life. But they also bring death. So it's always playing with these opposites and extremes, life and death, good and bad, heaven and earth, bringing them together, power and weak people. Always playing with those boundaries.
So do people look up to Latal?
Well, that's a good question, again, because it's kind of an ambivalence. Again, they admire Latal-like cleverness. But a clever person can also be very dangerous. So it goes both ways. Mm-hmm. They respect it, they honor it, but it's also he's just cockadoo, he's just naughty. And naughty people can cause all kinds of commotion and problems. So in a way, the Americans are just naughty.
Yeah.
They're going around causing trouble all over there, just like Latal. Yeah. But, but he'll also make some good things. They'll always talk about him as extreme. He's all love and all hate are with him. All kindness, all meanness. All these extremes are contained in this one character.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah. Now, I don't want you to get to the sense that that they say that this character Latal did all this and that's historical fact. That's not what's at stake here. Like all good story and mythologies, it's what they dramatize. And it's a way of thinking through the problem. And so it dramatizes and they playfully can explore these ambiguities of their life through Latal. And we all use narratives to try to make sense of where we're at and what our lives mean and why it is this way. It's no different than celebrating pioneers coming across the plain and God directed them to Utah. Okay? They're saying, okay, here's a story that helps us make sense of why we're here where we're at. So in a curious way, while they're very peripheral people, these are powerless, small little atoll dwellers on the earth. They know that they're meaningless in terms of global power. Okay? But the irony is, for them, it's kind of like, but in a way, we're the ones who created global power. We made the Americans.
Right. You're right. Yeah, that's what I loved about your article, how you said that even though they're talking about the Americans and Latau, they centralize it to them, which
Yes, right.
I really admired.
And it brings it back, and it's making sense on their terms. So instead of, we think of them, outsiders think of them as these are just these peripheral people who are insignificant, to the point that you have the Americans, government and military said that's right, so we can go out there in these places and exploit it and take what we want, because they are insignificant and meaningless. Henry Kissinger, I don't know if you've ever heard of him, he was the Secretary of State during Richard Nixon, okay? And he was, and the Marshallese were trying to do some reparations to get some legal support for what had taken place.
Yeah.
And Kissinger said, well, there's only 70,000 people out there. Who gives a damn? That's his quote.
Wow.
Okay. Well, those 70,000 people,
I think they give a damn.
it matters to them quite a bit. And so that's the way they've been thought of. But that's what's fun here, is because most of the world thinks of them as really insignificant. But I'm interested in how people see themselves and how they make sense of it, not how we impose on them and project things upon them. But from their vantage point, how do they position themselves and make meaning in the world and recreate that meaning? And they do it in a very fun, clever, playful way. And that trickster makes us think about things we normally don't think of. And so he challenges boundaries. Until there's the opposite, we really don't get what the original point is. Opposition in all things. Opposition gives us the ability to even comprehend any difference. It's through difference we recognize things. Singularity, we don't understand it. But when in contrast, I am not you, I am me. Only by my recognition of your difference to me do I even comprehend myself. At this larger level, that's what they're doing with this story. They're comprehending themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're a very, but you've got to. We also need to see that they're a very playful people. It's hard to imagine people who've been so exploited to be so. Yeah.
Well, what are modern representations of Latau? Or how do the stories keep going?
Well, besides the storytelling that, where I get all these stories about him going on to places. Well, sometimes, even in more contemporary popular literature and films that they're starting to do, he's kind of a character that plays into these things sometimes. This novel that's gotten a lot of attention out there called Melal. It's about Ebi and its overpopulation and how dirty and decadent it is. And Melal means in Marshallese the boat of demons. But they play on this. Latau the trickster shows up at all these key locations in the story, which is a lot of fun for me because the novelist went to many of my publications and my recordings of these stories and used the ones that I had found to put into this novel.
Interesting.
Another layer of these things. But also people can be tricksters in everyday life by being sly and clever, and they'll even refer. Latau, his name literally means the sly one. Okay, that's what that means. And then in everyday, in not every day, but performances for different celebrations, people enact the Latau-like character and be kind of a clever, playful buffoon that shows up, a clown. Even at the main Christmas festival, where they blur Jebro, the god of life and renewal, into the image of Christ, who is the Christ who gives life and renewal, because now they're Christian, and so they merge the Christian God with their traditional God.
Really?
And so right there in the middle of one of these celebrations about, the seriousness of the divine Christian God, the Latau buffoon will show up and do these funny dances. So
Really?
It's great. It's great. But a lot of the Marshallese, who are really good thinkers about this, will say he's kind of like Lucifer. And Lucifer has a role to play. Only through his temptations then do Adam and Eve start to become aware of themselves and their choices. Latau does the same thing. He makes us aware, and we start choosing. We're conscious of ourselves.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he gets blurred in some funny ways, even into today. Pious Christianity will say, Latau is bad.
Yeah.
Right. This is bad stuff. And others will just want to be dismissive of it, especially when they think that Western Christian people are watching them. No, they don't, that's just bad stuff. This is naughty stuff. But then on the flip side, every one of them are having fun with this idea.
I just want to have fun with it.
Interesting. So his name means, or the sly one, Latau does.
Yeah.
And one thing that you kind of addressed in one of your articles that seemed very sly to me, at least, was that certain politicians use Jebro, the god of like life and renewal, as a way to like align themselves with the public.
So while Latau is the image of power, gaining power through deception and usurpation, Jebro is the god of a power and authority through legitimate lines of descent. Okay, and so he becomes the image of the prototypical ideal leader. Of chiefly leadership. Jebro, the story is, real quickly, his mother, Langatangar, descends from the heavens. Her son, she has 10 sons at Alinglapalap Atoll. It means the Great Atoll. There in the east, she says there's going to be a paddling canoe race from the east to the west side of the lagoon. These are 30 miles wide, okay? These aren't these little ponds, okay? Right. In the story, there's no sails yet, so they're just paddling canoes. And whoever wins the race across the lagoon will become the first high chief. And she's going to grant that to him. This is a matrilineal society. Right? So the boys prepare their canoes and hurriedly make them ready. And then they launch out. The day of the race begins, and they launch out paddling across the lagoon. Immediately, the older boys get out ahead because they're stronger and older and faster. And there on the shore is their mother, Lungatangar, okay? And she calls out to them, and she said to her older son, she said, Tumar, take me along. That's what they said. It means take me along with you. He looks back and he sees his mother, and she has this big bundle, and he looks back and he thinks to himself, her weight and the weight of that bundle will be too much. It'll slow me down. I'll have to go back and get her, and I won't win the race. So he calls back to her and says, take my next younger sibling. And so she calls out to the next one, Mejilip, take me along. And he looks back and sees the same thing until she gets to the youngest son, Jebro. She calls out to Jebro. He looks back, thinks the same thing, but then he says, I must obey my mother and honor my mother. Turns his canoe around, goes and picks her up, starts paddling out. He's way behind. He's going slow. But then she starts to unfold from her bundle the first sail made out of the bandana sleeves. She has in her bundle this big, long pole and becomes the mast, the first mast, and the gaff and the boom and things, okay? And she helps him, show him how to rig it up and all of the ropes and how they tie up. And then immediately he's out tacking across the lagoon. He's passing all of his brothers. And he's passing them all, and then he gets to his oldest brother, Tumar, and his brother says, give me that boat. Because he's going to honor his brother too. He's a good guy. He's the good boy. And he gives it boat, and Tumar even throws his mother off that canoe. Biggest sign of disrespect. But just before Jebro was to jump off, his mother says, take the boom socket where they put the mount the boom down into the canoe. And he takes it. So Tumar tries to sail the canoe, but he can't control it because the boom socket's gone. Well, Jebro takes his brother's canoe and he paddles to the other side with his mother, but he arrives first. And when he arrives on the other side of the island, it is called J Islet, it is low tide. And he pulls the canoe up to the middle of the islet, so it can't be seen. And then he goes in, and his mother is decorating him the vestures, smells, putting certain kinds of oils on him to smell just right, and flowers, and his loincloth that signifies his authority. Tumar finally arrives in the canoe, but he thinks he's won because now it's high tide and all the tracks have been washed. And he starts celebrating himself. I've won, I'm going to be the high chief. Just as he's calling out, all the people and the mother and Jebro come walking from the middle of the islet, and they're singing and chanting that Jebro is chief. He makes the surface calm. He loves people. He feeds people. It's a chant. And Tumor is so mad at his brother, he refuses to look at him. Well, all these gods becomes constellations in the sky. Jebro is Pleiades in our Greek constellation. Okay, Tumor is Antares. Pleiades and Antares never see each other in the cycle of the seasons. When one is setting, the other one is rising. When Jebro or Pleiades is in the sky, it's calm waters, the food is good, the fishing is good, the rains are good, the winds die down. When Tumor comes back up into the sky, it becomes windy and blowing, and the waters are bad, and it's time of famine and drought. Okay, but they never see each other. Just like the brother refuses to ever look on his brother again.
Interesting.
But Jebro becomes the epitome of the obedient, loving, kind God who brings life back to the earth, who's ready to just sacrifice his own interests for his mother and others. So men are evaluated, are you like Jebro? Or are you like Tumor, the older brother, who is selfish and self-interested and egotistical?
Right.
And that's how this story is part of social life, but then in modern politics, politicians who can make themselves seem like Jebro are going to win. And they really try to make themselves appear as they're reenacting that kind of God.
You went into it a little bit in the article. So what do they do to align themselves with Jebro?
Yeah. So, for example, the ones that I was shown when I was doing my research there was one of the first presidents of the country, right? They get independence from the United States, but very still economically dependent. He's running for his campaign and to become the president again. So he was given political speeches. But it's really interesting. Right in the middle of his speech, he breaks away and starts talking about Jebro and this God that's brought all this wonderful good and life to the earth and took care and was honored his mother and honored the matriarchs and all this stuff. He's basically saying, that's me, right? I'm the God. I'm now the leader who will bring you abundance in the future, is going to be good for the Marshall Islands, just like Jebro did, So they do it in political speeches. They'll do it in everyday talk. I mean, I've been in situations where people will critique somebody, or somebody will like the behavior of some man, that he's behaving right and they admire it, and they'll say, "Ay, look at him with Jebro. He's just like Jebro." Okay?
Interesting.
Then they have songs that they have composed, and they sing and they play over the radio these kind of new pop songs. And they have all these references to Jebro and his mother. Okay? They're not singing about and celebrating the greedy old brother. It's always him. And then this politician, he was fantastic how he played this game. He put on this big feast, just like a good chief should, and he killed all these pigs, numerous pigs. It's just a big high status food, and was giving it to everybody, and they were all just coming to eat from what the big chief, but what Jebro did. But then on the stage, what he has going on is these performances, but one of the key performances is there's his mother and his sister, the matriarchal escort, right? In fact, her Lungatangra star is like a triangle, like the sail. And there's that sail carrying Pleiades across the sky. So there she sits up on this political stage, carrying her son to victory. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. So they're politically exploiting these images.
So I know you said that it's matrilineal or
Yes.
matrilineal. So are chiefs usually female or male?
Yeah, so that's a great question to clarify here.
Yeah.
A man's authority comes through his mother, okay? Not through his father. He belongs to his mother's family. His father has authority over his sister's sons. So the man, he's really deferring to his mother's brother. Okay, you follow that? Okay, it's a complicated social structure. It really is. It's mother's brother, okay, and sister's son. This is this really critical thing. If I could show you a very complex kinship chart that explains how that works. But just to make it simple, so and also when they get married, historically, a man will go live on the property, the land of his wife, and help raise the children there. And if he loves his wife and children, he's going to be really good to them. Because if not, they'll just run him off. He's expendable. They don't need him. His authority belongs anyway back over where his sisters are.
Oh, okay.
So a man ends up being kind of very an advocate, friendly pal to his kids, not the authoritarian figure. The authoritarian figure in a boy's life, for example, is my uncle, my mother's brother. He's the pain in my life because he's the one I'm getting my title and my land from. Okay?
Interesting.
It's a very different kind of dynamic of how families work. So, back to your question, remind me.
So are chiefs usually female or male?
Okay,
and
good.
How does that work?
So what happens is rank is not determined by gender.
Okay.
Okay? It's whoever's the oldest. Okay? So a
Male or
female can
female?
be male or female. So a
Okay.
female can be a chief
Mm-hmm.
or a lineage head. They call them Malap for the general lineage heads, or Nyoroich for the chiefly lineage head, for the chiefly lineages. But what happens is that in public, the brother
Mm-hmm.
will quite often be the voice, the mouthpiece. And so he'll look like he's the one in charge. Okay? But in truth is, he's not going to say anything until he's consulted his mother and his sisters, and they tell him what to say.
Wow.
And he's got to go, he's like, so in this society, it's brothers and sisters are the critical relationship. That's the one that's very profound.
Mm-hmm.
So she's very critical. So on the surface, it always seemed like the chief is the high one, but now the sister's the oldest. The oldest. She's the chief, and they call her Lerois, and the male chief is Irois. You can hear the same thing, right? And when they talk about siblings, they won't say brother or sister. They'll say Jaya Ajata, meaning my older or younger sibling.
Mm-hmm.
You have to add other words to designate the gender, because it's all about age.
Yeah.
But in public performance and authority, the male will take the kind of oratory role. Female will speak once in a while, but she'll usually just be back there calling the shots.
Interesting.
Okay?
Very
different kind
different.
of social alignments. Yeah. And so that's why you have in these gods, too, you have these male figures, but they're all they're sons of these key primal matriarchs who their power came from them. Letao's power to deceive came through his mother, Lime Jukarer, which her name literally means the woman who is a dirty thing. But she gave birth to all the animals that annoy us.
Oh, yeah. I remember
Cockroaches,
reading.
Yeah.
spiders,
Snakes
centipedes,
or-
all these kinds of things. And then she has this trickster son at the bottom. And he's the last of a very notorious family that is annoying. Okay? Where Jebro is the youngest child of this dignified goddess who brings sailing and all these good things to people.
Mm-hmm.
But they're actually, Jebro and Letao are cousins, because those two
Okay.
women are sisters.
Yes.
Okay?
Wow.
And he's the youngest. They're always the youngest. But Jebro's the youngest, but the Marshallese, it's not lost on them. Let's see. Isaac was younger.
Yeah.
Jacob was younger. Joseph was younger. It's always the younger one
It's
who
always the
somehow, because of their obedience or goodness or something, gets onto the top and turns upside down the normal birth order.
Yeah.
And now the Mormon Marshallese are, and Nephi was younger than Laman and Lemuel.
Yes.
This all makes sense.
It's all coming together. Wow.
And because social structures are hierarchical by age, but sometimes the better or more obedient one rises to the top. But we only tell the story when they do. When it doesn't happen, we don't tell that story. We just talk about the genealogy, who follows it.
Right.
So stories are always inserted to explain why everything got turned upside down.
Wow.
And that's in the Bible as well as in the Marshall Islands. Our stories talk about usurpation in the Bible.
What do you think that says about stories in general, if there's such similarities between cultures?
Well, stories reflect a lot of things. They reflect the consciousness of human beings, humankind. But they also are not just entertainment. Stories get social business done, and they explain the way things are. They give us a resource for living, not just for thinking about and enjoying. We live and enact our stories. Stories just don't reflect what we do, but we do what stories tell us. We live out our narratives, and we try to emulate them, play them out. And so cultures have these critical stories that then explain why this social structure is the way it is, why it changed from the way it had been, and now how do we play into it and live that out. And We as even Latter-day Saints are always being told, be like Christ, right? Act like him, act like the story.
Right.
So I would propose, but there's the good part of it and there's the negative, because then popular media and culture and advertising want you to live that story too. They're trying to give you a narrative to follow. If you just don't, if your relationship to her just doesn't work out right, there's something wrong with you, because the story is it all happens and happily in the end when boy meets girl, kind of thing. It gives us narratives of what even our male-female relationships should be, and we're supposed to live those. Or if you buy this thing, this is your story, and you'll be cool like that guy in the commercial. So they exploit it. It can be very negative, but it can also be very positive when you have good narratives to live out. Mm-hmm. And as we're sitting here at a university, we have a narrative: go to school, make something of yourself, get an education, go find your place in the world, go make a good living and an income. If you don't go to school, you'll fail. We have a narrative. We're living this narrative right here at this university. Mm-hmm. Marshallese have theirs. What is important? We have ours. What is important? Get an education. And if 40 years down the road, you find yourself that it didn't work out the story this way you wanted it to or should have been, what's wrong with him? Right?
Interesting.
Or you become a trickster like Latau and you create your own narrative.
Create your own. That's the moral of the story here.
Yeah, stories are powerful things. We think through them. They represent to us some of our deepest values and our beliefs and things we hold most dear. But we also live them. We live our narratives. And so, when people look down at us saying Marshallese are just funky, no, we all are. We're all doing this, just with different narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. So for Marshallese people, is the idea of challenging authority more readily accepted just because of this prevalence of Latau in the stories?
Well, that being a clever use of deception can be valued more than it is in some other cultures who think any kind of duplicity or deception is a social sin, a social wrong. But they don't like. They will critique and challenge just ignorant, malicious lying.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's just the Latau just creates a way of understanding that part of our humanity. That much of social life is achieved by veiled indirections and things. You'll get better. That's the nicest looking shirt I have seen. Okay, we do these kinds of things when you think that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Like, oh yeah, it looks great. You look great today. Okay, because it's intention. We're doing that because of maintaining positive social relationships. Marshallese recognize that too. That kind of indirection. Somebody who's has cancer and is going to die tomorrow. You still play the narrative of hope, right? And are you really lying, kind of thing? Marshallese would recognize that gradation. You're not telling the truth, but you're not lying for the intent to maliciously deceive. When you move into malicious deception, that's when Latau becomes a problem.
And evil. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Interesting.
Not when... to maintain social life at all, we have to sometimes not reveal the truth.
Right. Or else no one would want to be friends with us. We just all spoke what we thought all the time.
That would
be a mess.
Yes. You've seen cartoons where people just blurt out what's on their mind, or those little cartoon bubbles, right, that appear.
Yes.
And people could really see what we were thinking, right?
The danger zone.
What was that movie where there was a robot where they had an honesty setting, and then the person asked, I think it was Interstellar, they said I want 100% honesty, and then he's like, are you sure? Because 95% honesty is proven to be the best percentage or whatever.
Policy.
And you know, and some of us who don't want to be deceptive, then we avoid the truth. Right? When your friend says, "Don't you just love my clothes today, my outfit?" You wouldn't want to say, you either lie and say, yeah, that's beautiful, it's wonderful, or no, that's the ugliest thing I ever saw. You redirect it to something else.
You have opened up a box that you did not want to open up.
We were talking about Flat Earth today.
Yeah, the Flat Earth Society or
yeah. No, that's you know, we and all you have to do is just watch contemporary politics and this kind of stage flattering going on, right? Yeah. All right, for very politically distinct reasons. And if some people just take all the flatter at face value, they're pretty unsophisticated thinkers and social beings, right?
Yes.
But those who will step back and say, it's just that the Marshallese have developed a way to be really good at it. They're socialized in being really good at these kinds of veiled speech. It's like I've always been interested because the Polynesians, who are our friends here, right? They're very out. They're very open, this extroverted kind of thing. And even they and others will say, like, "Oh, those Micronesians are so quiet and cold. You know, they're so firm and they seem almost grumpy. You know, this kind of thing." And it's just a misunderstanding of the different communicative resources that each culture has. And Micronesians are they're very friendly and kind, will do anything for you. But they're not going to sit there and put it out on their sleeve, what they're doing, what they're thinking. And so even everyday speech can become a kind of poetic subversion kind of thing. Mm-hmm. It's kind of fun. And if you take them literally at face value, you're going to miss the point. And so many do.
Did you experience that when you were teaching here?
When I first got there, I knew that I was the butt of their jokes. And it took a while to figure that I'm still learning that stuff. Mm-hmm. And after all these years of hanging out with them and having them live in my house, I'm still figuring some of this out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us.
Well,
is there anything we left out?
Yeah, is there anything you have to say?
There's so many things. We'll leave it at that.
Awesome.
All right. Dialogues with the Trickster by Dr. Phillip H. McArthur.
Yes.
Don't forget the H. Make sure that's
it's essential. All right, this has been the Xeno Podcast.
All right.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. This was the Xeno Podcast. You can stay updated by following our Facebook and Instagram pages at Xeno Podcast.
This podcast was brought to you by BYU-Hawaii's Reading Writing Center.
You can also find us on YouTube or iTunes or by searching Xeno Podcast. That's Xeno Podcast.
If you have any questions or comments, you can email us at podcastzeno@gmail.com.
Thanks for learning by listening.